The bank's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as the line of customers stretched along the polished marble floor, their shoes tapping anxiously and hands fumbling with deposit slips and crumpled utility bills. But nobody paid much attention when the glass doors parted and an old man stepped through, stooped, slow, and worn like an artifact of another time, wearing khaki slacks that had seen too many winters, a tucked-in pale blue shirt with frayed cuffs, and a faded black baseball cap that simply read veteran in white stitching so faded it looked gray. And in his right hand, he clutched a folded manila envelope, edges curled, while his left gripped a wooden cane with careful precision as he moved, each step deliberate, as though the world spun a little too fast now for his joints to keep up. But his eyes, those still held a fire clouded perhaps by age, but sharpened by something else, something deeper, the way veterans sometimes looked when they measured rooms before speaking, scanning not just for exits but for energy, for risk, for threat, a quiet ghost of battlefield instincts that never fully fade. And yet, despite his presence, despite the badge of silent honor his posture carried, the teller didn't smile. When he arrived at the front of the line, she didn't lean forward warmly or ask how she could help. Instead, she blinked, forced a rehearsed smile, and said in that mechanical customer service tone, "I'll need a valid ID, sir." To which the old man, whose name we'll come to learn was Clarence Dobson, reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a scuffed leather wallet, flipping it open with shaking fingers to reveal a yellowed plastic card. Its lettering still legible, though the image had faded almost entirely. "This was issued to me back in '73, he said quietly, his voice steady but low, as if he already knew this wasn't going to go the way he hoped. And the teller squinted, frowned, called over a younger colleague who barely glanced at the card before muttering, "That can't be real." And another one chimed in, louder this time. "Is this some kind of prank?" Clarence tried to explain, to say this card had once opened base gates across the country, that he'd used it at VA offices for decades, that it was who he was, but nobody was listening. Not really. And a man in line muttered, "Bet he found that in a dumpster," loud enough for snickers to ripple through the crowd. And the words hit harder than they should have. Not because Clarence hadn't heard worse. He'd been spat on in '74, called a baby killer when he returned home, ignored at awards ceremonies, but because it was happening all over again. Right here, in a clean, well-lit bank where nobody knew or cared what those 3 shrapnel scars on his side had cost him, where history was just something taught in books and forgotten on Fridays. And as the staff raised their voices and people began pulling out phones, filming perhaps, waiting for the old man to snap or shout or break down, Clarence didn't raise his voice, didn't beg, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, like a monument of flesh and bone, tired but unshaken, a man who had once walked through rice paddies with bullets snapping past his ears, and now found himself being judged by teenagers who thought valor expired like milk. And just as the teller said, "We can't verify this. We're going to have to ask you to leave, sir," the door behind them swung open with a gust of dry summer wind, and in walked a figure who changed everything. The door swung shut behind the newcomer, and a sudden hush spread across the bank as though everyone had instinctively recognized authority. Before even realizing who stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, his chest framed by a dark blue service uniform heavy with rows of ribbons and medals, his cap tucked neatly under his arm, and the sharp glint of polished insignia catching the fluorescent light in a way that seemed almost theatrical, and the room shifted, phones lowering, chuckles silenced, as this man strode forward with the kind of confidence that only decades of disciplined service could forge, every step echoing on the marble like a gavel, his eyes scanning the scene until they fell on Clarence, on the frail figure in the cap that had been mocked, on the trembling hand still holding the weathered ID, on the quiet dignity of a man surrounded by suspicion, and his jaw tightened. His stride quickened, and when he stopped, he did not face the tellers, nor the gawking crowd, but Clarence himself, raising his hand in a crisp, flawless salute, snapping his heels together, his voice ringing out in perfect clarity. "Major Clarence M. Dobson, sir, permission to stand at ease in your presence." And the bank fell into such silence that even the buzzing of the lights seemed to vanish. And Clarence blinked, eyes wet but sharp, whispering, "Do I know you, Captain?" And the man nodded, lowering his salute only after Clarence returned it, slow and shaky but precise. "My name is Robert Johnson. Sir Colonel James Johnson was my father, 5th Infantry, Da Nang. 68. You carried him to miles under fire when his leg was shattered, saved his life and mine by extension, because without him I wouldn't be standing here today." And now Clarence's lips trembled, memory striking like lightning through fog. James. He kept that picture of his boy in his breast pocket, showed it to me in the middle of a firefight, said he had to make it home for you, and Robert's voice cracked as he replied, "And he did, because of you." And now the staff were frozen, mouths ajar, customers shifting uncomfortably, realizing the magnitude of what they'd just witnessed. Realizing their whispers of fake and scam had been hurled at a man whose quiet service had rippled through generations, whose forgotten ID was older and truer than any of their assumptions. And the manager stammered something about procedures. But Robert turned sharply, his voice cold steel. "Procedures? Your procedure just humiliated a decorated veteran, a man who bled for this flag while you sat in climate control counting checks. You should be ashamed." And though his tone never rose, its weight landed heavier than any shout, leaving the staff pale, scrambling for apologies. But Clarence shook his head, voice faint but firm. "No, son. Let them be. It's not the first time the world forgot." And that broke something deeper in the room, because it was not anger, but resignation, the weary acceptance of a man who had carried more than any civilian could imagine, and learned to expect nothing in return. And Robert, chest heaving, turned back to the crowd, eyes scanning each face. And he said quietly, "You're standing in the presence of a hero." And, as if on cue, a woman near the back placed her hand on her heart, whispering, "Thank you for your service." And then another, and another, until the whole lobby seemed to bow beneath the weight of respect. Customers lowering their heads, a man in a suit saluting clumsily, a young boy whispering to his mother, "Is he a soldier, Mama?" And Clarence, overwhelmed, swayed slightly, gripping his cane tighter, whispering, "I was once," and Robert steadied him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You still are, sir, always will be." And together they walked to the counter, where the teller, trembling now, processed the withdrawal with hands that could barely hold the bills, sliding the envelope across the glass with an apology that stuck in her throat. But Clarence only nodded, taking it gently, sliding it into his jacket, and as he turned to leave, the young boy stepped forward, eyes wide, voice trembling with reverence. "Sir, what's it like to be a hero?" And Clarence stopped, knelt slowly despite the protest of his knees, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and said, "It's not about being a hero, it's about never turning your back when someone needs you." And with that he stood, adjusted his cap, and walked toward the doors, the crowd parting like water round a ship, silent, reverent, ashamed, yet grateful. And Robert walked beside him, carrying not just his father's debt, but a new vow to ensure the world never again forgot men like Clarence, men who lived quietly among them, invisible until disrespect forced their legacy into light. As the heavy glass doors closed behind them, the sharp chill of the outside air wrapped around Clarence's frail frame, like a long-forgotten friend, and Robert offered to drive him home. But Clarence shook his head softly. "I walked here. I'll walk back." And when Robert insisted, he finally relented with a nod and a tired smile. "Long as we don't drive too fast." And the two men got into the captain's black government sedan, the engine humming low as they pulled away from the bank, leaving behind a lobby of stunned silence and unspoken guilt, and the ride began quietly, neither man speaking, both staring ahead as the desert wind whipped dust across the narrow streets. But finally, Robert asked, "Sir, why didn't you say something? You could have told them who you were." And Clarence, eyes on the horizon, replied without looking over, "And what would I say? That I once wore stripes that don't fit anymore? That I used to jump out of helicopters before my knees gave out? Son, this country only listens when someone else vouches for you. It doesn't care much for the quiet kind." And Robert didn't know what to say to that, because it was true. And Clarence continued, "I've watched the world change more times than I've changed socks this month. I've seen enemies become allies and friends become strangers. But you know, what's never changed?" He paused, turning to Robert now, eyes glinting. "People forget. They forget the price. They forget the faces. And worst of all, they forget the ones who never came back." And now Robert felt a lump rising in his throat, because in those few words, he felt the weight of decades Clarence had carried alone, of funerals with too few guests, of medals buried in drawers, of memories that no one asked about anymore. And when they reached the small, worn house on the edge of town, Clarence invited him in, and Robert hesitated for a moment before accepting, stepping into a living room that felt like a museum of American history. Faded photographs in black and white frames, folded flags in triangular glass cases, shelves lined with dusty books, and worn medals. One wall adorned with a single, creased newspaper clipping from 1969 with the headline, "Soldier carries comrade to miles under fire," and Clarence moved slowly toward a recliner and dropped into it with a sigh, as though gravity itself had been stronger lately, and Robert took a seat opposite him, absorbing the atmosphere of memory and sacrifice that saturated the room. And Clarence gestured toward a photo. "That's my squad. 67, just outside Hugh. 5 of those boys didn't make it back. I still hear 'em sometimes, at night, when the house gets too quiet," and his voice wavered for the first time, not from age, but from weight, and Robert leaned forward. "You ever talk about it?" And Clarence chuckled softly. "You mean with therapists?" "No, son. I talked about it with whiskey for a few years, then with silence. Silence is a better listener, doesn't try to fix you." And now Robert understood what the bank couldn't. That this man wasn't just a relic of war, he was still carrying it. One breath at a time, one memory at a time, one quiet trip to the bank at a time, and Clarence reached for a small wooden box beside his chair, opening it slowly, revealing a purple heart, a silver star, and a photo of a young woman with soft eyes and a radiant smile. And he said, "That's Helen. My wife. She waited through Korea, waited through Vietnam, but she couldn't wait through the silence. Cancer got her before I could get back from the last tour. I missed her funeral by a day." And Robert swallowed hard, not knowing what to say. But Clarence saved him from it by smiling gently. "It's all right," she knew. "I wrote her every week. She just couldn't write back that last month." And he closed the box carefully, as though putting the pain back to sleep. And Robert sat in stillness, realizing that this man wasn't just surviving, he was enduring, quietly, nobly. In a world that no longer paused to salute unless it was Veterans Day, and Robert asked, "Sir, why did you really go to the bank today?" And Clarence replied, "To withdraw $70. It's Helen's birthday. I buy her flowers every year. Lay them on the windowsill like she's still sitting there, humming those old songs." And Robert had no more words left, because nothing in his life, no speech, no uniform, no title, had prepared him for this kind of honor, this kind of love, this kind of loss wrapped in dignity. And in that moment, Robert knew that what he'd done at the bank wasn't just a defense of a man's name, but a defense of everything America forgets in its rush for convenience. The slow, quiet, painful strength of men like Clarence, who never ask for a thank you, who don't need hashtags or headlines, who simply carry the weight of freedom so others don't have to feel its cost. Clarence leaned back in his recliner, and for a moment, the living room fell into such a deep silence that even the old wall clock seemed to slow down, its ticking muffled by the weight of the memory settling over both men. And then, without warning, Clarence's gaze drifted toward the window, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping the armrest in a rhythm that no one else would have understood. But Robert did, because it was the kind of rhythm you hear only in war. 3 slow taps, 1 pause, 2 fast ones, Clarence code for movement under fire. And Robert knew then that Clarence wasn't really sitting in this living room anymore. Not entirely. He was back there, somewhere far away, surrounded by jungle rot, diesel fumes, and the sound of distant gunfire, and Clarence's voice, when it returned, came like wind through an old radio, not weak, but weathered, shaped by time and trauma. We were dug in about 6 clicks southeast of Da Nang. Mud everywhere. You couldn't stand up without sliding. Johnson's unit was supposed to rotate out that night, but comms went dead around 1800. We knew something was wrong, but command said sit tight. I said screw that, and now Robert leaned forward, eyes wide. Because this was it. This was the moment his father had told him about, in fragments, in whispers, in the kind of voice men use when they talk about the day they should have died. And Clarence continued, I took 5 guys. Not enough. Never is. We moved through the creek bed, real low. Saw smoke first, then the sounds screaming, shouting in Vietnamese. Then silence. That's worse than noise. And now Robert saw Clarence's eyes shift, not just with memory, but pain. Like a man who had rehearsed this story in his mind for decades, but never told it out loud. When we got there, they were pinned. Johnson was bleeding out behind an overturned jeep. 3 dead already. 1 kid screaming for his mom. He couldn't have been more than 19. And Robert felt his stomach tighten, because he could picture it too clearly now. I dragged Johnson out first. He kept trying to crawl, even with a leg like mush. Said he had a picture of you in his chest pocket. Said he had to live long enough to show you how to tie a tie. Can you believe that? Clarence let out a soft, broken chuckle. In the middle of hell. And that's what he said. And Robert smiled weakly. He did show me. And he told me about you. Every time he took me fishing. Every time we watched old war movies. Said the only reason I existed was because of a man named Clarence, who didn't follow orders that night. And now both men sat quietly, the air between them electric with emotion and ghosts, until Clarence exhaled slowly and said, I never told anyone that story. Not even Helen. Not because I didn't want to. Just didn't think it mattered anymore. Most people don't care what you did once you can't run anymore. And Robert shook his head, his voice firm. Well, it matters now. It's going to matter to a lot more people. And Clarence tilted his head, amused. You gonna put me on a billboard? And Robert grinned, something like that. But he meant it. Because as they sat there, one man old, forgotten, heavy with memories, the other still in uniform, but forever changed, it was clear this story wasn't just a footnote in history. It was a lesson the world needed to hear. Days passed quietly after that evening, but something had shifted, not just between Clarence and Robert, but in the very fabric of the town that had once ignored him. It began subtly, with the bank manager arriving at Clarence's door the next morning, red-faced and stammering, holding a large bouquet of flowers and an envelope with a formal apology letter inside. Mr. Dobson. There's no excuse for what happened, he began. But Clarence, never one to bask in apologies, waved it off. Just teach your people better, he said simply. But even then, the manager didn't leave. He asked if Clarence would agree to speak with their corporate office over Zoom for staff-wide training on respecting veterans and the elderly, to which Clarence chuckled. Zoom. You want me to talk to a camera? But eventually, he agreed, not because he wanted attention, but because if one teller could be taught, maybe 1,000 more could follow. And then the next thing happened. The young woman at the bank, the one who first dismissed him, posted on her private social media a long note of reflection, owning her mistake, saying she had never met someone like Clarence, and that the moment had changed her forever. And the post went viral overnight, sparking comment threads from other veterans, family members, and people who realized they'd made similar assumptions in their own lives. And soon after that, a local reporter came knocking, asking to feature Clarence's story on the town's evening news segment. And while Clarence initially declined, Robert gently convinced him otherwise, saying, "Sir, this isn't about you. It's about every vet who was ever looked past." And Clarence reluctantly agreed, and when the segment aired, showing clips of Clarence holding old medals, recounting stories of carrying men through rice fields, of waiting through nights where death felt inevitable, of losing his squad one by one over decades, it touched something deep in the community's heart. And within a week, the story was picked up nationally, spreading through veterans' forums, military pages, then mainstream networks. Forgotten hero found at bank. The headlines read, Vietnam vet humiliated then saluted by officer's son he saved. And with every retelling, Clarence's name climbed from obscurity into reverence, and yet he remained unchanged, sitting in his recliner, sipping lukewarm tea, and still buying flowers on Helen's birthday with a quiet grace that fame could never touch. And yet, the world didn't stop reaching out. Letters began arriving daily from all over the country, children drawing thank you cards in crayon, veterans writing to say, "I thought no one remembered us," widows sending photos of husbands who never came home, each envelope packed with tears and gratitude. And Clarence read everyone, eyes glassy but steady, whispering now and then to the photos on his mantle, "Look at this, Helen." They finally remembered, and then came the call from Washington, a formal invitation to attend the upcoming National Day of Valor at Arlington Cemetery, where his name would be read aloud during a candlelight vigil for the first time in public. And Clarence, at first, refused again, muttering, "I'm not built for speeches and cameras." But Robert said, "Then don't speak. Just stand. Let them see what sacrifice looks like when it grows old and quiet." And Clarence nodded, because something inside him knew it wasn't about pride, it was about presence. And when the day arrived, and he stood on the steps of that sacred ground with the wind whispering through the trees, and the flags snapping gently in the breeze, surrounded by families holding photos, widows holding folded flags, and soldiers standing at full attention, Clarence didn't speak a single word. But when his name echoed from the microphone, Major Clarence M. Dobson, Vietnam, Korea, World War II, the crowd rose to its feet. Not with applause, but with tears, and the silence that followed spoke louder than any anthem. The ceremony at Arlington ended with quiet goodbyes and camera flashes held respectfully low, and Clarence returned home to find that the quiet street where he lived had changed just a little. Neighbors who used to pass by with nods, now stopped to wave. A small wooden bench appeared on his front porch with a brass plaque that simply read, "Reserved for a man who stood when others fell." And a retired Marine down the road began bringing him groceries without asking, claiming it gave him an excuse to get some air. But Clarence saw through it and appreciated it in silence, and yet, through all the national attention, all the letters and cameras and kindness, Clarence's daily routine never changed. He still visited Helen's grave every Sunday, with the same slow walk, the same single rose, and the same quiet conversation, whispering, "It's gotten louder out here. Darling, I think the world finally paused for a second." And one afternoon, weeks after the Arlington trip, while sitting on the bench out front, he noticed a boy no older than 10 staring from the sidewalk, his backpack hanging loosely from one arm, hair messy, eyes curious. And Clarence nodded toward him. "You lost, soldier?" And the boy blinked, then smiled shyly and said, "Are you the man from the news?" And Clarence chuckled. Only if the news said, "I'm slow and grumpy," which made the boy laugh. And over the next few weeks, the boy Liam began visiting after school, sometimes with questions about war, sometimes just to sit and listen. And Clarence, who never had kids of his own, found something healing in those visits, like passing the weight of memory to someone who actually wanted to carry it. And one day, Liam asked, "Do you ever miss being a soldier?" And Clarence paused for a long time before answering, "I miss the men. I miss the meaning, but not the noise, not the loss." And Liam, quiet for once, nodded solemnly like he understood something even most adults couldn't. And from that day forward, he called Clarence sir, even outside of earshot. And one Saturday, Liam asked if he could do a school project about him. And Clarence said, "Sure, long as you don't make me look too heroic." I used to scream like a little girl in basic training, and when Liam handed in his project weeks later, a giant poster board with the title "The Quietest Hero on My Block," his teacher cried reading it, and the school invited Clarence to speak at an assembly, which he politely declined, instead writing a letter they read aloud, ending with the words, "Courage isn't loud. It walks softly with a heavy memory." And just when it seemed Clarence had finally stepped into the light the world once denied him, his body began to fail him, not all at once, but quietly, like the sun lowering behind mountains. And Robert noticed first how Clarence now took the stairs slower, how his hand trembled slightly when lifting his teacup, how his once sharp voice now came in raspier tones. And Clarence knew too. But he never complained, never mentioned it, just began to organize things, his medals polished and arranged, letters bundled by war, photos labeled in pencil on the back, and one manila folder marked to be opened only after that he handed to Robert with a firm look. "Don't peek." And Robert promised. And the final visit to the bank happened on a warm Tuesday afternoon, when Clarence, dressed as always in that same faded veteran cap, entered to find a new interior, photographs of local veterans on the wall, a banner that read "Service Before Self," and a chair placed permanently near the entrance with a plaque beneath it. "Major C.M. Dobson sat here." We listened, finally, and as he walked to the counter, the young teller a new one. Fresh out of college, stood up quickly and saluted, fumbling slightly. "Sir, it's an honor," and Clarence smiled. "No need for all that. I'm just here to get a 20, and the teller, nervous but proud, handed it over and whispered, "I'm studying military history now. Because of you." And Clarence nodded once, then turned, walking slowly out with the weight of generations behind him, past the plaque, past the chair, past the guilt that no longer lived there. The last time Robert saw Clarence, it was just after sunset. The old man was sitting on that porch bench, cane resting between his knees, a cup of black coffee in one hand and a small folded American flag in the other. Not the one from Helen's funeral, but a different one, smaller, faded. A field keepsake he had carried since Korea, and they didn't speak much that evening. Just watched the sun bleed into the mountains like a memory being folded into silence. And when Robert finally stood to leave, Clarence only said, "Tell them it mattered." And Robert nodded without asking what he meant. He knew, and the next morning, Clarence didn't wake up. He was found in his recliner, hands folded neatly over his chest, wearing his service shirt, medals pinned straight down the left side, and a handwritten note sitting on the coffee table that simply read, "Don't mourn me with flags, mourn me with action." And the town did mourn, but not with parades or speeches. Instead, people brought handwritten letters to the house, laid flowers on the porch steps, and left coins atop the bench like soldiers do on headstones. And Robert, shaken but composed, opened the envelope Clarence had given him days earlier, marked to be opened only after. And inside was a 3-page handwritten letter, no punctuation missing, no emotions spared, and it began, "If you're reading this, it means I finally took that nap I kept putting off." And Robert smiled through tears. Because, of course, Clarence would begin like that, but the letter quickly turned serious, recounting memories of the wars, of faces Robert would never know but Clarence had never forgotten, of regrets too heavy to say aloud but too sacred to take to the grave. And then came a section addressed directly to Robert. "You've got something. Most men chase their whole lives' purpose. Keep it. Guard it. Don't let the world exhaust it. You've got the voice I never used. Use it right." And the final page contained instructions Clarence wanted followed. Not for ceremony, but for legacy. He wanted Liam to be given one medal, his Bronze Star, along with a note that simply read, "So you remember what quiet strength looks like." And he wanted his folded flag buried in his backyard next to Helen's garden, where the sun hits first in the morning. And Robert honored every word, and when Liam received the medal, he held it like treasure, whispering, "I'll never forget." And later that week, while planting wildflowers around the garden in Clarence's memory, Liam found a buried wooden box inside, a photo of Clarence and Helen dancing in the rain during leave in 1952, soaked and laughing, and a note that said, "If love survives war, it deserves to be remembered." And Robert later told the town about it during a quiet gathering in Clarence's yard, where veterans and strangers alike stood with candles, heads bowed, not to honor death, but to acknowledge a life fully lived in silence and service. And weeks later, A nationwide news broadcast featured Clarence's story, ending with a surprise. The president himself, during a Memorial Day address, paused for a moment of silence in honor of those like Major Clarence Dobson who never asked for the spotlight, but whose shadow shaped generations and across the country for 60 silent seconds. People stood still in living rooms and parks and classrooms not because they had to, but because they finally understood. Years passed, as they always do, slowly at first, and then all at once. And the bench where Clarence used to sit became worn from visitors, veterans, students, strangers who heard the story and just wanted to be near the place where quiet strength once lived. And the town, once just another forgotten dot on the map, became something else entirely, a place known for remembering what the world forgets. And that transformation reached its peak the day they opened the Clarence M. Dobson Memorial School of Leadership. A modest brick building with wide glass windows, a flagpole that never let the banner fall below full pride, and a quote engraved at its entrance in bronze letters, "Courage doesn't shout, it shows up." And the first class to graduate from that school carried his story with them, including one young man standing tall at the podium, his voice deep, confident, but soft as he said, "Everything I know about real strength, I learned from a man who didn't need applause." And that young man was Liam, now 17, sharp-jawed, steady-eyed, and planning to enlist, not for glory, but for service. And before he shipped out, he visited Clarence's backyard one last time, knelt by the flowers growing wild along the fence, and placed the bronze star on a small rock engraved with Clarence's initials, whispering, "You're still teaching me, sir." And as for Robert, now older, grayer, but still wearing his sheriff's badge with quiet pride, he spent his weekends giving talks not about law, but about legacy, how one man, forgotten by the system, humbled by war, and honored too late, ended up changing an entire town just by existing with dignity. And at one of those talks, an audience member once asked, if Clarence were here today, what do you think he'd say about all this? And Robert didn't hesitate. He'd say it's not about him. It never was. It's about remembering who we're supposed to be. And the final story, the one not many know, happened on a quiet fall evening, years after Clarence had passed, when Robert found a sealed envelope buried in an old footlocker in his attic, addressed simply, "For when it's all too loud." And inside was a small cassette tape and a folded note that read, "Sometimes words need a voice. Let this be mine." And Robert played the tape in his truck's dusty cassette deck. And Clarence's voice, low, steady, warm, filled the space. "If you're hearing this, it means the world's gotten noisy again. That's okay. It happens. But if you remember anything about me, let it be this: strength doesn't need to be seen, only felt. And if you ever doubt that a single quiet life can shift a generation, then look around. Look at Liam. Look at the bench. Look at what grew out of silence." And with that, the tape ended, the static humming gently like wind through trees. And Robert sat still for a long time, eyes closed, heart full. And later that week, he placed the tape in a museum display case next to Clarence's boots and cap. beneath a sign that read, "His war ended." His echo didn't, and sometimes, when the wind's just right, people say you can still hear footsteps on the porch, the creak of the old bench, maybe even the hum of a cassette, but more than anything, what Clarence left behind wasn't noise, it was the permission to be strong, without needing a spotlight, to love without needing thanks, and to serve without needing to be seen.